Speak Mandarin, she's just the maid she won't understand. The words cracked across the glass-walled boardroom like a whip. The CEO, Martin Kessler, laughed at his own cruelty. His colleagues smirked nervously, unsure whether to echo him or stay silent. The black maid in the corner, Amara, stood with her hands steady on a polished silver tray, pouring green tea into porcelain cups. Her uniform was spotless, her posture unbent, but the insult rang in her chest like a gong. The Beijing investors shifted in their seats. Some glanced at her, some looked away. In this world, help was invisible, but Martin had dragged her into the spotlight, only to make her the punchline. The tray trembled just slightly in Amara's grip. She adjusted it so no one would notice. Inside, her jaw clenched. Would you endure this? Martin swaggered to the head of the table. Now, gentlemen, while we wait for our missing interpreter, let me assure you that our deal is airtight. He slapped the contract folder with performative confidence. The leather cover gleamed under the recessed lights. His staff shifted uncomfortably. The interpreter had been confirmed but was nowhere in sight. The manager, a pale man with clammy hands, scribbled meaningless phrases on a notepad, pretending to prepare. The investors exchanged a glance. Their lead representative, Mr. Zhao, tapped a single clause in the contract, his pen sharp against the paper. He raised an eyebrow. Mandarin rolled off his tongue in a clipped question. Martin laughed, waving his hand dismissively. Don't worry about the details. Everything has been translated accurately. But Amara from the corner heard it. The words Zhao had spoken. The one line he questioned. The mistranslation pulsed in her head like neon. Her life before this room felt distant, the university lectures, the late nights translating texts, the summers spent immersed in Beijing's rhythm. All buried now beneath starched uniforms, late-night shifts, and the silence of survival. But language is a muscle. Even when unspoken, it remembers. She held her breath, balancing the tray. The investors repeated the question, louder now. Martin stammered, his grin cracking. "Where's the damn interpreter?" he snapped at the manager. The man paled, fumbling with his phone. No one answered. Amara's eyes flicked down at the polished tray. In its reflection, she saw her own face, framed by the contract's highlighted line. Her lips parted. The Mandarin slipped out before fear could stop it. Ta bing bu shi luren fengxiang, air shi zichen juanrang. It does not say profit sharing. It says asset transfer. The room froze. Every head turned toward her. The investor's eyes widened. Mr. Zhao leaned forward, stunned. Martin blinked as though the air had betrayed him. The silver tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier, as if it carried not porcelain cups but the weight of revelation. And yet Amara's voice had been calm, clear, unapologetic. The silence didn't last long. Martin snapped first as if swatting a fly. "Cute trick," he said, smiling without warmth. "We've got party tricks and parlor maids. Somebody get her out of the way." A few chuckles sputtered around the table, hollow, obedient. The office manager hurried toward Amara, whispering, Just keep pouring, please," as though tone alone could push her back into invisibility. Mr. Zhao kept his pen poised over the contract, eyes resetting on Amara. His colleagues traded looks of surprise that hardened into curiosity. He repeated slowly, "Zichen Juanrang, asset transfer." Amara steadied the silver tray against her hip. "Yes," she said, English now, careful not to sound like she was correcting anyone. "The wording refers to title, not profits." "Enough," Martin cut in, hands carving the air. "She knows a phrase. Everyone picks up a phrase or two from a kung fu movie. Let's continue." "Sir," the manager tried, voice wavering. "The interpreter, he's not answering his phone." Martin's grin was all teeth. "Then interpret, Tony. It's your job to make problems disappear." Tony went the color of printer paper. Across the table, the CFO, a woman in her 50s with precise hair and anxious eyes, flipped to the highlighted page. "Section 7, she murmured. "Are we sure the translation draft we approved?" "We're sure," Martin said flatly, "the way men are sure when they've put their certainty on the company card." The room pretended to breathe normally. Chairs creaked, porcelain kissed saucers. Somewhere, an air vent sighed like a bored god. The building's skyline view pressed against the glass, all chrome and confidence. Amara reached for the last cup. The tray's rim brushed the folder, nudging the paper just enough to tilt toward her. She glimpsed the subclause number, 7.4. A tiny detail she'd seen 1,000 times in 1,000 contracts that had never been hers to sign. Behind the march of years that brought her here, the second jobs, the late buses, the janitor closets doubling as break rooms lived a different rhythm. Classroom chalk, cold libraries with radiators that ticked like metronomes. A year in Beijing when the city smelled like rain and sesame oil and subway breaks. She'd learned the weight of tones, how a single syllable could climb or fall and take meaning with it. A single syllable could turn a company into collateral. "Tea?" she asked softly, offering Mr. Zhao the final cup. He accepted with a small nod, the kind men offer to equals when they don't want anyone to see them do it. Martin clapped his hands once. "Gentlemen, we're losing daylight." He tapped the leather folder. "Here's what matters, our valuation holds. Your board gets 2 seats and the timeline is locked. If your legal team wants to nitpick translation, we'll handle it post-signature." "Post-signature," Mr. Zhao repeated, a question dressed as a smile. The legal counsel shifted. "We can add a clarifying rider," he whispered down the table to the CFO. "After closing. Or," the CFO said, not quite loud enough to count as defiance, "we can make sure we understand before we lock the whole ship to the dock." Martin swiveled toward Tony like a cannon. "Did I stutter? Where is my interpreter?" Tony swallowed. "His car broke down. He's across town. He says 40 minutes. We'll be done in 15. Martin leaned into the investors with salesman warmth. "We're all professionals here." The word professionals hung like perfume, sweet, choking, designed to overpower the scent of doubt. A junior assistant darted in with a plate of lemon cookies. She looked at Amara, then at the floor, as if uncertain who ranked above whom in a room where uniforms told lies. The investors murmured to one another. They weren't angry. They were interested, in the line that had been skimmed, in the maid who hadn't. Amara placed the tray on the sideboard, lining each empty saucer with the precision of a surgeon laying out tools. The tray itself caught the room and reduced it to a circle of light, faces warped, status smudged. The engraved lip read Kessler Tower, 20th floor in letters that had outlived 3 CEO. "Ma'am," Tony hissed at her shoulder, panic making his whisper a squeal, "I need you to please stop talking, please. He's in a mood." She studied Tony's jittering hands, the pen marks on his cuff, the coffee stain he hadn't noticed, the subtle violence his power did to the uncertain. She lowered her voice so only he could hear. "You know that clause is wrong." Tony's eyes flashed. He did know, or at least he knew enough to fear the space where certainty should live. Martin's phone vibrated. He checked the screen, exhaled through his nose, then plastered a grin back on. "So," he told the investors, "why don't we get to the signature page while our interpreter, bless his heart, fights traffic?" Mr. Zhao sipped tea. "We wait," he said in English crisp as winter. He turned deliberately back to Amara. "Your tones are native. Where did you learn?" The question wasn't a trap. It was a hand extended, palm up. But hands in rooms like these were often snatched back once the cameras rolled. Amara felt the room's gaze brace like a muscle. She could offer a harmless story, tourist phrases, a neighbor who taught me, a podcast I liked, and sink back into the wallpaper where nice girls were allowed to survive. Or she could speak a sliver of the truth and let the drill hit bone. She chose something in between. "At school," she said. "And life," Martin barked a laugh. "Which school? Cleaners University, my God." He stood, spreading his arms to include the city. "You see what I'm dealing with? Everyone's an expert." The laugh traveled the table like a wave that people felt required to surf. Even the legal counsel smiled thinly, a man protecting his pension. Amara kept her face smooth, the way one keeps a mirror smooth in a storm. Internally, a tide surged and receded. Years collapsed. The scholarship letter she'd folded and unfolded until the crease split, the day she left home with a suitcase that smelled like lavender soap, the first time a professor had said, "Your ear is clean. Don't let anyone make it dirty." Mr. Zhao placed his cup down with ceremonial care. He addressed Tony, because hierarchy is a ritual that everyone performs even when the altar is crooked. "Bring interpreter," he said. "We will not sign until language is precise. Precision shows respect." "Exactly," Martin said too quickly, scrambling to own the principle that had just undermined him. "We value respect." He pivoted to the whiteboard, drawing a box labeled Synergy in block letters that looked, to Amara, like a cage around a bird the drawer had never seen fly. He talked about market share. He talked about lightning-fast integration. He talked while the clock above the door ticked with metronomic malice. The CFO scribbled notes, then underlined 7.43 times. Her pen carved the paper like a chisel. Amara collected the empty cups. The tray grew heavier with every loop of the room, not because porcelain weighed more, but because truth did. She felt the cold of the metal seep into her palm and anchor her against the humiliation trained to make people float away from themselves. As she moved behind Martin, she heard the word again, not from the investors, but from him. Transfer, he said, swinging his marker for emphasis. The English word careless, the Mandarin absent, he didn't even hear himself proving her point. Tony drifted near the door, phone to ear, promising the interpreter extra money, a car, a miracle. He mouthed 10 minutes. The numbers in rooms like this were always small until they weren't. Mr. Zhao glanced at Amara's hands. Not at her face, not at her uniform, at the hands that had poured tea without spilling, that had turned a tray into a mirror that told less flattering truths. He asked, gently in Mandarin, Nai Jia O Shane Mi Mingzi. What is your name? She answered before fear could wrap itself around her throat. Amala, she said, Amara. The syllables, simple and unadorned, landed on the table like a calling card. Martin snapped around. We're done with the Maid show, he said. Tony, escort her out. Sir, Tony started. Now, a beat of hush. The kind that decides which story the room will tell itself later, we didn't know. We were following procedure. We were just trying to keep the meeting on track. The kind that asks you to co-sign your own erasure for the comfort of men who will never learn the cost. Amara lifted the tray. It gleamed, a small moon. Her reflection stared back, not grand, not furious, simply present. She thought of the professor who told her once, language is the closest thing we have to a scalpel for reality. Use it cleanly. She thought of rent due. She thought of the cleaner who swapped shifts so she could be home when her mother's pills ran low. She thought of the interpreter stuck behind a car accident and a life she could have had if the word almost wasn't so greedy. She took a step toward the door, the choreography of survival. Then she stopped. Sir, she said, voice steady, not to Martin but to the space above the contract where everyone was pretending to see only numbers. If the signature happens before clarity, Section 7.4 activates immediately. There will be no fixing it later. There will be a transfer. Irrevocable. Tony closed his eyes like a prayer. The CFO looked up, really looked, the way people do when the math finally frightens them more than defiance does. Martin, she said, her pen hovering, we need to slow down. Or we need to move faster, he shot back, before they spook. Mr. Zhao smiled, courteous as a blade. We do not spook, we raid. The word read settled over the table like a verdict. Amara felt every gaze converge, then slide away, then return as if their eyes were learning a new route through the room. The tray impressed a crescent into her palm she wouldn't notice until later. She lifted her chin the smallest distance a person can lift and still be called modest. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't ask for permission. She had given the warning that would let them choose the kind of people they were going to be. Would you endure being told to disappear after saving them from themselves? Outside the boardroom, the city kept glittering, indifferent. Inside, a door handle turned. Footsteps hurried up the hall, hopeful, harried, the sound of a solution people preferred because it arrived wearing a suit. The interpreter was still 10 minutes away. The next 10 minutes would decide whether the room could hear the truth from a uniform it didn't respect. The footsteps outside quickened. The boardroom door swung open and everyone exhaled in relief. Too soon. It wasn't the interpreter. A young assistant entered, cheeks flushed, clutching her tablet like a shield. He's still stuck on the freeway, multiple lane pileup. Estimated arrival 40 minutes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Martin's jaw flexed. Then he's useless. He turned to the investors, still smiling like a magician whose rabbit had escaped. Gentlemen, I suggest we move forward anyway. My team can handle the paperwork. Mr. Zhao folded his hands neatly. We prefer clarity. We are clear, Martin said, a little too fast. He jabbed his finger at the page. Our lawyers have confirmed every line. The CFO coughed into her sleeve. Not denial, not agreement, just a sound that filled the silence Martin refused to. Amara stood by the sideboard, tray still in her hands. She could feel the weight of porcelain cups against the polished steel. Every reflection shimmered back at her, the investor's narrowed eyes, Tony's trembling pen, Martin's wolfish grin. The claws was a tripwire and Martin was leading them straight across. She shifted the tray to her other hand. The metal bit into her palm, grounding her. "Sir," she said carefully, "he is asking about the wrong word. Profit sharing is not what the text says. It says asset transfer. The difference is ownership." Her voice was low but steady. Every face turned again. Tony flinched. "Don't," he whispered, his lips barely moving. "Don't put yourself in this." But it was too late. Mr. Zhao tilted his head, eyes sharp with interest. "She is correct." He tapped the page with his pen once, twice. "It says transfer." A ripple of Mandarin passed among the investors. Their voices rose, clipped, urgent. Martin slapped the table. "This is ridiculous. Are we seriously taking contract advice from someone carrying a tray?" His words cracked like a whip again, but this time the sound didn't echo. It landed flat, like a stone in sand. The investors didn't laugh. The CFO didn't look away. Even Tony stared at the floor as if afraid that looking up would mean choosing sides. The tray grew heavier still. Amara placed it on the polished sideboard, deliberately, letting the metal kiss the surface with a soft chime. Her hands were free now. She stepped closer to the table, not at its head, but at its edge where light from the window spilled across the papers. The contract glowed faintly, as though daring someone to read it honestly. "Look here," she said softly, tapping section 7.4 with a fingertip. "The character for Changquan ownership is unmistakable. If you sign, you forfeit control." Gasps escaped the investors. Martin's face purpled. "Security," the word cracked the air. Two guards outside the door stirred. Amara didn't flinch. She met Martin's glare. "If they sign this contract without correction, this company becomes theirs. Irrevocably, no rider will undo it." For the first time, true silence blanketed the room. The CFO whispered, "She's right." Tony finally looked up, his voice hoarse. "Clause 7.4, if it's ownership, not profit, then we." His words died, but the conclusion hung there like smoke. Martin slammed the folder shut. "Enough, she's poisoning the room." But the investors weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at her. Mr. Zhao leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. His English was crisp, deliberate. "We listened to her." Those 4 words bent the balance of the room. Amara felt her pulse in her throat, steady but undeniable. The silver tray on the sideboard caught the light, throwing a sharp reflection against the glass wall like a mirror angled toward truth. For years, she had carried that tray, invisible. Today, it had carried her voice into the center of power. The catalyst had struck. The boardroom no longer saw her as the maid in uniform. They saw her as the only one in the room who actually understood what was written. And Martin, red-faced, fists clenched, understood something else. The room was slipping away from him. The command had already left Martin's lips. "Security!" 2 guards pushed open the glass doors, shoulders squared, ready to escort the maid who had dared to speak. But before they could take a step, Mr. Zhao raised his hand. The motion was subtle, but it carried the weight of an empire behind it. The guards froze mid-stride, uncertain whose authority to obey. The CEO fumed. "She's staff. She doesn't belong here." Mr. Zhao turned his gaze to Amara, calm, appraising. "Repeat, please," he said in Mandarin. "Line 7, clause 4. Amara's hands no longer carried the tray. They were free, trembling slightly but steady enough to trace the words on the contract. She recited the passage again, each tone precise, her cadence as fluid as a river she had never forgotten. When she finished, the room remained hushed. Mr. Zhao nodded once. Perfect pronunciation. His eyes sharpened. Not memorized. Lived. The CFO leaned forward, papers rustling under her fingertips. "If she's correct, then everything changes. This isn't just a translation error, this is a structural trap." Martin slammed a palm against the table. "You're letting the help dictate international law now. Are you insane?" The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were old, the chorus she had heard in whispers and sneers her entire life. Invisible, expendable, incapable. But now every eye was on her, and she did not bend. Amara breathed deeply, summoning the professor's voice from years ago. "Language is a blade. Handle it carefully or it cuts the wrong throat." She spoke slowly, her English soft but unwavering. This line does not describe partnership, it describes ownership. If you sign, the assets are no longer yours, they are theirs. The investors broke into rapid Mandarin among themselves, their words sharp with urgency. Even those who had been silent now leaned forward, listening to her cadence as if the entire contract had to be reheard through her mouth. Tony scribbled frantic notes. The CFO underlined sections until the page bled blue ink. Martin, desperate, barked a laugh. "Gentlemen, she's grandstanding. A cleaner with a hobby. Are you going to risk millions on a maid's bedtime language course?" The mockery rang hollow this time, because Amara didn't flinch. She didn't backpedal. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood at the edge of the table, fingertips resting lightly on the contract, her posture steady as though she belonged there all along. And the silence that followed didn't belong to Martin anymore. It belonged to her. Mr. Zhao leaned back, eyes never leaving Amara. "How long have you spoken Mandarin?" Amara hesitated. The truth, years of study, immersion, exams, conferences, the dream of becoming a legal interpreter before life derailed her, burned against the cage of silence she had built around herself. But she chose the fragment that mattered, long enough to hear what others don't want you to know. A flicker passed across Zhao's face, the kind of recognition men give when they know a battlefield has shifted. The guards still stood at the door, confused, waiting. Martin gestured sharply. "Get her out." This time the CFO voice rose, calm but steel-edged. "No, if she's right, then forcing her out is negligence. We can't afford to dismiss this." Martin spun toward her, jaw tightening. "Whose side are you on?" Her pen tapped the contract. "The side that doesn't lose the company overnight." Amara felt her pulse steady. She wasn't in control of the room, not yet, but she had stopped its collapse into Martin's performance. She had given it pause, and in that pause, truth had oxygen. The silver tray on the sideboard glinted faintly, catching the light like a silent witness. The very object that once chained her to invisibility now reflected her defiance back at the men who had dismissed her. She remembered the CTA she carried silently inside. If that happened to you, what would you do? The investors quieted, their debate concluding with a single look exchanged between Zhao and his deputy. Zhao spoke softly, but every syllable landed like a stone. "We continue. With her." Gasps erupted. Tony dropped his pen. The CFO covered her mouth to hide a grin. Martin stood stunned, stripped of his authority. "You cannot be serious." Zhao didn't look at him. He looked only at Amara. "Translate the rest." And just like that, the balance of the room tilted. Martin's smile came back like a mask that had been reheated. "Fine," he said, voice bright with poison. "If our helper is so fluent, let's give her a little fun. Quick test." He plucked a dry erase marker from the tray of the whiteboard and twirled it like a baton. "Translate exactly what I say, word for word, no notes, no stuttering. Ready?" Amara didn't move from the table's edge. "We should focus on the contract." "Oh, I insist," he said, eyes glittering. He rattled off a string of nonsense English jargon, half startup pitch, half locker room metaphor. "Our hockey stick synergy crushes their TAM when we quarterback the runway, got it." Laughter peeped from the insecure corners of the room. She waited for the noise to die. Then in Mandarin, clean and unhurried, she rendered not only the words but the intent, the swagger, the empty promise, the slippery boast. The investors burst into low chuckles. Mr. Zhao's mouth twitched. Martin blinked. He doubled down. "Okay, scholar, idioms." He scrawled on the board in clumsy strokes, Hashe Tianzu. "What's that then?" Amara looked at the characters that begged to be set free from his hand. "To paint a snake and add feet," she said, still in Mandarin. "To ruin something by doing too much." Her eyes met his. "A warning about unnecessary performance." A few of the staff coughed into their fists to hide smiles. Martin shifted tactics. Different dialect. He fired a phrase in Cantonese he'd lifted from a movie, tones warped beyond recognition. The investors exchanged pained looks. "I speak Mandarin," Amara said evenly. "But if you want to play games with languages you don't respect, we can spend the day here and still not sign your contract." The room held its breath. Even the vents seemed to stop humming. Martin's veneer cracked. He reached for the leather folder, yanked it open to the highlighted page, and stabbed a finger at the clause. You misread this, it's profit rights. Xiaoyaquan, Amara said softly, would be profit rights. This is Soyaquan ownership. She drew no breath before adding, and here, Buke Chixiao irrevocable. Once transferred, it's not coming back. Tony's pen snapped in his hand. Ink dotted his cuff like a sudden constellation. The CFO peered closer. She's right about the characters, she murmured, almost to herself. They're not even close. Martin snorted. To untrained eyes. He grabbed a coaster from the table, slapped it onto the cool glass, then lifted it. Condensation printed a foggy circle. Show us, then. Amara reached for the silver tray. It had collected a thin skin of condensation from the tea. Under the lights, it was a quiet moon. With her index finger, she traced two quick, confident forms into the mist, Quan and Quan, close cousins to the untrained, different species to anyone who truly read. Next to them, she drew Yi and Yu, anchored by Quan again. 4 characters, 2 paths, income or ownership. She angled the tray so the investors could see. Mr. Zhao leaned in. Clear, he said. His deputy nodded. Martin's laugh came high and brittle. Parlor tricks on a platter. Words on a tray saved your company 5 minutes ago, the CFO said, and nobody laughed. Martin's jaw throbbed. He pivoted to cruelty. He flicked the back of his hand against the tray's rim as he passed. A petulant tap meant to jar her. Porcelain rattled. A cup slid, then stopped. Amara's other hand caught it mid-skid with the reflex of someone who has steadied countless breakable things no one bothered to notice. Pick up the crumbs, Martin said, pointing to a lemon cookie that had shattered under his heel. While the adults handle business. Amara held his gaze for a heartbeat that hummed. Then she set the tray down carefully, took a breath, and did not move. The adults, she said, are asking for clarity. She turned to the investors and in Mandarin continued, the term here is not Fenhong profit distribution. It's Changquan's Yuanrang transfer of title. You are not negotiating revenue. You are surrendering control. Mr. Zhao's eyes softened with a respect that did not need a microphone. We hear you, Martin whirled on Tony. HR. Her file, now. If she's going to impersonate counsel, I want everything background references, disciplinary history. Tony's fingers trembled over his phone. He didn't dial. Sir, I. Now, Tony didn't move. Bias changed masks. Where did you learn Mandarin? Martin asked Amara, sweet as glass. A boyfriend. A YouTube channel between shifts. Amara felt the old ache flare and pass, like weather in bone. I learned it where people learn things they intend to honor, she said. In classrooms and in kitchens, with books and with people. I learned it well enough to know when it is being used to hide theft. The legal counsel cleared his throat. We should, at minimum, pause, he said, as if the word pause had just been invented and he was patenting it. We'll do no such thing, Martin snapped. He turned to the investors with salesman warmth reheated for the 3rd time. Gentlemen, please don't be offended by our spirited staff. We can sign now and attach a language clarification later. In our experience, Mr. Zhao said mildly, language clarifications do not change ownership once transferred. The trap sealed on its setter. Martin saw it happening and lunged for a new insult. Look, he said, gesturing at Amara's uniform as if it were evidence. I don't know what immigrant sob story you're auditioning for, but this is a boardroom. And language is the board, the CFO said before she could stop herself. A new silence opened, cooler, cleaner, the kind that made room. Amara glanced at the tray. Its misted surface still held her quick lesson in tiny rivers of water, Quan next to Quan, Yi beside you. In the reflection, the room was flattened, its corners softened, its men the same size as its women, the same size as its maid. The symbol that had always been a boundary felt, for one charged second, like a threshold. Translate the rest, Mr. Zhao said again, more firmly. Martin tried one last trick. If she's so competent, let her sign liability, put her name on it. She wants to play expert, make her responsible. Amara didn't blink. I will not sign your negligence, she said. But I will speak the truth in 2 languages so you can decide whether you are negligent. There it was, the only contract she could live with. A murmur rippled from the corridor. The interpreter had finally arrived, breathless apology in 4 languages. He took one step in, assessed the scene, the misted tray, the drawn characters, the tipped balance, and stopped as if the room itself had told him to wait his turn. Martin pounced. At last, "You translate. Tell them she's wrong." The interpreter scanned the clause. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at Amara, then at the investors, then back to the characters shining faintly in condensation. "She's not wrong," he said. "If anything, the draft you approved understates the consequence." The boardroom gave a collective exhale that wasn't relief, it was an admission. Martin's hands curled white on the leather folder. "This is insubordination." "It's interpretation," the CFO said. "The thing we hired professionals to do and then refused to hear." A hot, indignant anger rose in the room, not toward Amara, but toward the habit of men who would rather break the truth than break their stride. If your dignity were forced into a party trick, would you bow, or draw the line where it cut? Amara lifted the tray again, not as a shield, not as a prop, but as a surface on which the truth had written itself and stayed. She set it by the contract, a silent witness. "Section by section," Mr. Zhao said. "We start over." Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. For once he had nothing to translate. The restart was brutal. Contracts were never written for poetry, but hearing them translated clause by clause, line by line, felt like watching stone crumble into dust. Amara stood at the table's edge, reading the Mandarin and explaining in English. Each word she spoke steadied the room, even as the storm inside her chest churned. She wasn't counsel. She wasn't hired for this. Every syllable she uttered was a step deeper into dangerous territory, but also a step closer to the truth no one else dared claim. The interpreter, now seated sheepishly at the far end, merely nodded as she read. Every time he tried to interject, Zhao silenced him with a lifted finger. The CFO scribbled notes furiously. The junior staff typed as though minutes were gold, and Martin glared at her with a smile carved so tight it could have cut glass. "You're enjoying yourself, aren't you?" he murmured under his breath, low enough for the table not to hear. Finally, center stage. "You think this makes you important?" Amara didn't turn. She traced another clause with her fingertip. "This provision locks you into a 5-year non-compete under Chinese jurisdiction. You'll be unable to pivot your assets outside their market." The CFO froze mid-note. 5 years. That's not what we agreed." Zhao inclined his head. "It is what you signed." The weight of the truth shifted the room another inch toward her. Martin's fury flared. "Enough," he barked, louder this time. "She's overstepping. She doesn't have credentials, she doesn't have clearance. You all want to hand over millions to the Maid's bedtime hobby." "Better than to your overconfidence," the CFO muttered. Martin snapped his head toward her, eyes blazing. But before he could retort, Zhao spoke again. "She is correct. Every clause she has explained is correct. We trust accuracy, not titles." The trap Martin had set was now the cage closing around him. He switched tactics, leaning close to Amara as she bent over the page. His whisper was a knife. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you? I can make sure you never work in this city again. I can ruin you with one phone call." Amara's hand trembled just slightly against the contract. Her life outside this room, the bills, the second job, her mother's medicine, the rent already late pressed down on her chest. But then she saw the silver tray glinting from the sideboard, still faintly marked with the ghost of the character she had traced. Ownership. Irrevocable. Her jaw hardened. She whispered back, "You already lost your company. All you can ruin now is yourself." The investors leaned forward as she continued translating. The interpreter simply nodded in agreement each time. The rhythm became undeniable, Amara's voice calm and measured, followed by Zhao's solemn nod, followed by the CFO frantic underlining. Clause after clause, the hidden traps surfaced. Clauses that would have handed over intellectual property. Clauses that would have stripped minority shareholders of voting rights. Clauses that were invisible in English but screamingly obvious in Mandarin. Each revelation was a hammer blow against Martin's performance. Tony slipped out quietly, phone in hand, face pale. A few minutes later he returned, sliding a paper across the CFO notepad. She read, eyes narrowing. She turned to Martin. "You didn't approve this through legal." Martin waved a hand. "Of course I did." "No," she said, voice sharp now. "The approval signature is forged." Gasps filled the room. Amara closed the folder gently, her part spoken for now. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat, didn't explain the obvious. The tray glinted again as if reflecting the truth back to every corner. Martin's mask shattered. "Do you understand what you've done?" he hissed at her. "You've embarrassed this company, you've embarrassed me." Her eyes finally lifted to his. "No," she said. "You did that yourself." The words struck harder than volume ever could. For the first time, Martin lost control of the boardroom. Investors whispered, staff scribbled, the CFO snapped instructions to the junior analyst. Martin barked orders, but they washed over the room like wind over stone, loud, forceful, but powerless to move what was rooted. And in the center of it all, Amara stood steady, the contract under her fingertips, the tray nearby like a silent partner. The pressure mounted with every minute. The interpreter cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps I should continue." "No," Zhao said firmly. "She continues." Amara's heart pounded. Every word she spoke was another invitation for Martin to retaliate later, but every word also shielded the room from a catastrophic mistake. For the first time in years, she felt the strange, unsteady weight of authority, not given, not requested, but claimed because no one else had the courage to bear it. When the final clause was read, Zhao sat back. "We have heard enough." He folded his hands. "This contract is a theft. We will renegotiate or there is no deal." The CFO pen stopped. The staff leaned back in their chairs. Even the guards at the door seemed to understand the storm had passed over them and landed squarely on Martin. And Amara, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The tray still shone on the sideboard, carrying the reflection of a woman who had been dismissed, tested, mocked, and still held her ground. Martin spat venom. "This isn't over." But the room had already decided who they would listen to, and it wasn't him. The boardroom had shifted. The investors listened to Amara. The CFO deferred to her clarity. Even the interpreter had stepped aside. For a breath, she almost believed it might last. Then Martin struck. "Out," he said, voice low and venomous. "Now." The guards at the door tensed. He jabbed a finger toward Amara like a general giving a kill order. "This woman is not authorized. She's a liability. Remove her from the building immediately." The words were thunder. Amara stood still, her fingers resting lightly on the contract. The silver tray gleamed at her side like a shield she had no right to carry. "Sir," the CFO began, "I don't think that's wise." "It's my company," Martin roared, his voice cracking through the glass. "And I decide who stays in this room." The guards advanced. One reached for her elbow, polite but firm. Amara didn't resist. She straightened, lifted the tray, and gathered the porcelain cups one by one with steady hands. The clinking filled the silence like a funeral bell. She carried the tray toward the door, each step echoing on the marble floor. She could feel the room's eyes on her back, some pitying, some fearful, some silently grateful she had spoken aloud what they hadn't dared. But pity wasn't protection. Gratitude wasn't enough. She was still just the maid to them, and Martin had reminded everyone of it. Mr. Zhao rose half from his chair. "We would prefer she stay." Martin's laugh came sharp. "She is staff. She cleans your crumbs. Don't mistake her for counsel." The guard's hand brushed Amara's arm. She stopped. Slowly, she turned back to the table. Her eyes met Zhao's, then the CFO, then Tony's pale face. She searched for any sign of defense, any hand raised to shield her. None came. Even Zhao, who had nodded in respect minutes ago, now sat back. Diplomacy had its limits. He would not jeopardize the deal for her. The sting was sharp but familiar. The world always bent back toward hierarchy, no matter how truth tried to pull it elsewhere. Her mind whispered her mother's voice, "Don't give them a reason. Don't make it worse." So Amara lowered her gaze, balanced the tray, and let herself be escorted from the boardroom. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, like a book closing before the final chapter is read. The hallway was silent. Only the hum of elevators and the muted tick of a wall clock kept her company. She set the tray down on a console table and looked at her reflection in its polished surface. Her face looked the same, calm, expressionless, but her chest burned. Inside the room, her words had reshaped millions of dollars worth of decisions. Out here, she was invisible again. Tony slipped out a few minutes later, eyes darting around nervously. He whispered, "I'm sorry, I tried to." Amara shook her head. "You don't need to explain." "You shouldn't have said anything," he blurted. "You made it worse for yourself." The words landed like stones. He wasn't wrong. Her next paycheck, her job, even her apartment could vanish with one call from Martin. Tony hesitated, then slipped her a folded piece of paper. "For what it's worth, you were right." Then he hurried back inside before anyone noticed. Amara opened the paper. A single phrase scribbled in ink, clause 7.4 irrevocable. She closed her fist around it, the paper crackling like dry leaves. Through the glass wall she could still see the silhouettes of men arguing, pacing, shouting. She had cracked their facade, but now they were building it back without her. For a moment, despair pressed down heavy, like the city's whole skyline resting on her shoulders. She thought of her rent, her mother's prescriptions, the double shifts, the way Martin's voice would follow her even if she found another job, maid, cleaner, staff. Maybe Tony was right, maybe she had only made it worse. The elevator dinged. A group of interns filed out, laughing, arms full of coffee trays and binders. None of them looked at her twice. She was invisible again. And yet, from behind the glass, she heard a single phrase in Mandarin rise above the chaos. Zichen Juan rang. Asset transfer. Her correction was still alive in the room. They might erase her name, but they could not erase her truth. She touched the edge of the tray one last time before lifting it again. Her reflection stared back, silent but steady. Inside the boardroom, the storm finally broke. Voices overlapped in two languages. Chairs scraped. The interpreter's face shone with sweat as he tried to herd meaning into neat lines that wouldn't stand. Martin's hand kept slamming the leather folder shut as if he could trap the truth inside it. The CFO stood now, not sitting, her pen an exclamation point with no sentence to land on. Through the glass, Amara watched the chaos like a swimmer on the other side of an aquarium wall. She could see everything. They could not hear her. She picked up the silver tray, intending to retreat to the service corridor and breathe where the building forgot people when the door opened a crack. "Wait," the CFO said, half in, half out, voice low as a confession. "Please." A second later, Mr. Zhao appeared beside her. The man who had nodded at her tones now bowed the smallest fraction of an inch, not ceremonial but human. "We cannot proceed," he said, measured, "without the person who actually reads this." From behind them, Martin exploded. "Absolutely not. She is not staff for negotiations." Zhao's eyes didn't leave Amara. "That is precisely what makes her credible." The guard at the door looked to Martin, then to the investors, then to the CFO, then to the tray in Amara's hands as if it too now had rank. Slowly, the door widened. Amara crossed the threshold, the tray balanced like a moon in her hands. The room reset around her. Martin sneered. "Back for an encore." Amara set the tray down at the head of the table. It clicked softly against the glass like a gavel that needed no judge. She didn't take the CEO bait. Instead, she turned the tray slightly so it mirrored the page's block of characters, and the faces bent toward it. A round of light pooled over section 7.4. She looked to Mr. Zhao. "May I?" He gestured open palm to the contract. "Please." Amara flattened the pages with 3 fingertips. The interpreter slid a little closer, ready to shadow. She began in Mandarin, voice even, deliberate, letting each tone land. "Yiju ben zi yi zhai dai shi tia o, ruo zhang ying wan tia o quen kunzai chei, yi zheng wan ban ben wei zhun." The interpreter echoed in English for the table. "Pursuant to Article 10 of this agreement, if there is any inconsistency between the Chinese and English provisions, the Chinese version shall prevail." The room went utterly still. There was the twist, embedded in plain sight the whole time, not merely a bad translation but a supremacy clause that crowned the Chinese text king. The clarifying rider later Martin kept selling would be duct tape on a severed line. The CFO exhaled like someone surfacing. "So our English draft is decorative, window dressing," Amara said. "The meaning lives here." She touched the characters. Martin laughed too loudly. "Every cross-border contract has boilerplate. You're dramatizing legal wallpaper." Amara didn't look up. "Wallpaper doesn't own your assets." A junior analyst choked on a lemon cookie. She continued, the interpreter following a half-beat behind like an echo that made her words official. Clause 7.4 uses all the ownership language. Soyao Quan, Cheng Quan, Zhuanrang, Buke Chixiao. No profit terms, no revenue terms, and Article 10 gives this text control. The investors murmured, a low roll of thunder from a far continent. Zhao's deputy pointed to a tiny footnote. And here, he said in Mandarin, the transfer triggers upon signature, not closing. The interpreter relayed it. Heads snapped toward the page. In other words, Amara said, if you sign today, your IP moves today. Not after your press release, not after your victory lap, today. The CFO reached for the back of a chair as if the room had tilted. Tony whispered, literal goosebumps when she spoke, not realizing he'd said it out loud. The admission hung in the air, a fragile truth of its own. Martin shoved the folder at the interpreter. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. The interpreter met Amara's eyes, then Zhao's, then the CFO. He swallowed. It is not a misunderstanding, he said in careful English. It is precise. Martin rounded on him. You're fired. No, the CFO said, her voice like tempered glass. You are.